Doom. Certainly one of the biggest games of all time, Doom is the father of first-person shooter games and the crown jewel of id Software's golden age. Despite looking very simple, over 20 years after its original release, Doom's gameplay still holds up surprisingly well. Doom. Considered one of the best games of 2016, this game surprised everyone as it recaptured the magic of the original in a modern setting, dropping a lot of baggage first-person shooter games have acquired over the years. It's too early to tell the impact Doom will have on first-person shooters in the coming years, and it certainly was never gonna have an impact as large as the original, but it's still a really good game in its own right. In this series, I'm gonna analyze the original Doom as I usually do, but I'll follow that up by taking a similar look at the reimagined 2016 Doom, and then I'll compare them in terms of gameplay and level design. Instead of just saying one is better than the other, I want to use this opportunity to comment on how video games have changed over those 23 years between those two titles. The original Doom was released in 1993 by id Software and publisher GT Interactive, through a shareware model. This game was created by building upon everything id's previous title, Wolfenstein 3D, had done, with much more advanced graphics and more elaborate level design. Immediately, the biggest difference a player used to more modern first-person shooter games will notice while playing Doom is how fast it is. As soon as you boot the game, you can immediately pick a difficulty and start at the first level. No introductions, no cutscenes, no fluff. Even the music itself helps pump up the player for a lot of action. Doom's soundtrack varies a lot in terms of how energetic it is, with many songs creating a darker and somber tone, but the song that plays on the very first level is certainly the one that is better suited to throw the player right in the middle of the action. The main character, usually just called Doom Guy, moves at a speed that is absolutely unrealistic, while still being able to change directions on a dime. There is very little concern for realism in Doom's gameplay. One of the main remaining limitations of Doom's engine was the fact that the game is actually not three-dimensional behind the scenes. While rooms can have different heights, everything is running on a two-dimensional plane. This has two main effects on the gameplay. First, levels are huge, sprawling and maze-like, as it was simply impossible to create spiraling complex levels on a plane. Second, there is no aiming up or down in Doom. As long as the enemy is horizontally in front of you, you just have to shoot. This ends up making the experience easier. You never need a lot of precision in this game. Just turn to your enemy's general direction and blast it away. Of course, Doom was released at a time when not every computer had a mouse. In fact, the now usual method of playing with the W, A, S and D keys and the mouse was far from a standard, and most people just played with a keyboard. Doom was, therefore, designed with this kind of gameplay in mind, meaning aiming up or down might even have been an intentional omission. It is very convenient that playing this with a mouse means that even someone that sucks horribly at first-person shooters like me can play Doom somewhat decently. Doom's weapons also don't require a lot of precision to use. The pistol is the starting weapon. It's very weak, but it has a rather high rate of fire for a video game pistol. It is useful to take down some weaker enemies, but not much else. The shotgun is basically Doom's main weapon. It can fire about once per second and deals good damage. What sets Doom's shotgun apart from its counterparts in more recent games is its reach. In basically every game, a shotgun is a short-range weapon, dealing devastating damage on a cone near the player but effectively useless against anything more than a few meters away. In Doom, while the bullets do spread like in other games, the effect is much more subdued, and you can both kill groups of enemies nearby and all the way across the room. Coupled with the abundance of ammo, the shotgun is Doom's most versatile weapon. The chain gun uses the same ammo as the pistol, but has a very high rate of fire that allows players to fill a room with bullets. The plasma gun is similar to the chain gun but with larger and visible projectiles. The rocket launcher has a big explosion radius, and finally the BFG 9000 usually just kills everything in the room. None of the weapons also need reloading, which in other games means the player has to hide while waiting for the weapon to be ready for more. There is no such forced downtime in Doom. And that's where we get to the meat of things, the gameplay. Doom is a very simple game. There is no plot to speak of, except for very brief text interludes between the episodes. There is also not much complexity to the gameplay. The player's actions are limited to running, shooting, and interacting with doors or switches. The player can also change between two movement speeds, but there is absolutely no penalty involved in just toggling the running option on and running at God knows how many kilometers per hour. The result is a game that is just simple fun. Without any cutscenes, the levels in Doom are all structured around simply finding the exit. They usually center around finding up to 3 keys, which allow the player to open different doors. In fact, level designer John Romero has mentioned that Doom's levels were inspired by the original Legend of Zelda, as you unlock new areas to explore with each key much like you would in a Zelda dungeon. The levels in Doom, therefore, actually involve a lot of exploration in between all of the action. Frequently, there will be a window showing where to go, leaving to the player the task of finding the way there. There is also a fair bit of influence from horror movies, in particular the Alien franchise. Especially during the first half of the game, there are plenty of moments that go for a calm tension, shutting down the lights and forcing the player to carefully navigate the darkness. Opening doors with switches will also frequently open additional doors filled with demons. The lighting was another one of the big technological leaps of the Doom engine, so it is no wonder the developers used it as much as possible. The result of all that is a game that has a very interesting pace, with bursts of action or scarier moments separated by quieter moments of exploration. As I've mentioned before, many of the pieces in the soundtrack are quiet and somber, helping to create an atmosphere that is not simply mowing down demons with guitars blasting in the background. In fact, Doom 3 is a game that was basically built from the ground up to follow on this horror aspect of the original game. Nowadays though, the level design is one of the biggest points of discussion around Doom. While many praise the huge levels, especially when compared to the very linear environments of, say, a Call of Duty game, others also consider them a relic of the 90s that should just stay there. Personally, I think Doom's levels are well structured enough so the hunt for keycards doesn't turn into aimless wandering. The keycards are also frequently positioned in a way that simply makes the player follow a mostly linear path through the level. Other contemporary games, though, make me understand this complaint much more. Star Wars Dark Forces, for example, one of the many games that run on a modified Doom engine, quickly spirals into wandering gigantic levels full of one-way passages over and over again. The level design is certainly one of the driving forces behind Doom's success, even if it's not as often mentioned as the gameplay. Doom 2, which is basically the same game with extra monsters, weapons and new levels, had many of the key developers involved in the first game busy working on what eventually became Quake. And as a result, the level design is noticeably different. with a much bigger emphasis on facing hordes of enemies at once over exploration. I'm not saying that is necessarily bad, of course, but it's a change in priority that makes me prefer the original over the sequel. It's this philosophy in level design that, for example, inspired the level pack Doom the way id did, which, as the name implies, strives to design levels with the same balance of action and exploration the original developers had. Another thing I really like about Doom is the way it deals with difficulty. Even today, most games will increase difficulty by simply making enemies hit harder and receive less damage, without any other changes. It is the simplest way and certainly happens because it's not worth it to invest a lot of development time into making difficulty options that few people will use. It's perfectly understandable, but Doom does a bit more. Going up on the creatively named Doom difficulties will, instead of making monsters stronger, increase their numbers and how effective they are. The spawns of hell are much faster and accurate in higher difficulties, but still go down with the same number of bullets. Instead of the boring slog of many games becoming higher difficulties, with the player having to spend half of their bullets just to take down a weak enemy, the Doom guy is still as powerful as before. It's immensely satisfying how a single shotgun blast can still take down the most common enemies, the imps and the possessed soldiers, turning the game into an amazingly fun experience in the ultra-violence difficulty. The number and value of health and ammo pickups also changes slightly, and some levels even have small changes in layout, such as key positioning, in higher difficulties. And then there's the Nightmare difficulty. This mode was added on a later version of the game that, curiously, also included mouse support on the menus. The game itself warns the player that this mode isn't even remotely fair, and it's being fully honest. Nightmare includes monsters that shoot the player almost instantly on sight. They're also faster, have faster projectiles, and, uniquely to this difficulty, respawn after a while. The reason I mentioned the extra mouse support is that I am almost sure this mode was added specially for mouse players, as even ultra-violence is already incredibly hard with a keyboard only. While Doom is an incredibly simplistic game for today's standards, there is something very compelling in that simplicity. I was far too young to play it when it first released, but even when played for the first time in the 21st century, it is still a really fun game. Before I get to the 2016 remake though, what would happen if modern developers got to design levels for the original Doom? Would things be the same or would levels be more streamlined? Luckily, we have the answer for that in a level pack called No Rest for the Living, released with the Xbox Live Arcade release of Doom and later packaged in the Doom 3 BFG edition. On part 2 of the series, we're gonna take a look at this level pack's first level and compare it with a level of the original game. Thank you very much for watching and I'm sorry for the delay. Next time, we're going back to Ocarina of Time. Thank you again, and until next time.